there are no more rules of the game. However much we try to make this rational and so on, there are no more rules of the game. There are no more alliances for the Trump folks. There are no more regional organizations that are the lines here. There is only what Donald Trump thinks is good for Donald Trump and what his advisors think is good for American power. And that's the new world that we have to try to deal with, starting with Venezuela, but going across the globe beyond Latin America to Europe and elsewhere.
Hi, I'm Fergus Macphee, and welcome to the Trump Report on Times Radio. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday, on our YouTube channel, and you can also listen to the show wherever you get your podcasts. Joining me today is Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the Clinton Institute, University College Dublin. Scott, it's your first time on the show in 2026. Welcome back.
Well, Happy New Year, but so much for a slow start. So looking forward to chatting.
Absolutely. We were saying just before we started recording, it was a busy start to the show in 2025, and it's been no different this time round. We're going to be talking exclusively today about the situation in Venezuela. Overnight, Donald Trump warned Venezuela's new interim leader, Delcy Rodriguez, that she would pay a very big price if she doesn't do what's right. Right now, what is that in the mind of Donald Trump? What is right?
Well, there's two different things here, Fergus. One is what's in the mind of Donald Trump, and that gets us into crazy land, and we'll have to try to get through that mess. But in terms of the others in the Trump administration, I think what's interesting here and what has been emerging over the past 48 hours is they're not looking at regime change, which is what I thought they were looking at when they abducted Maduro on Saturday, whisked him away, made a big deal about the military operation. And it's like, okay, does that mean now they're going to stir up the Venezuela population to rise up against the government or the regime, whatever you want to call it? And which opposition leadership are they going to support to put into power? And Trump was going as far in that crazed press conference on Saturday where he was talking about the U.S. occupying the country. We will run Venezuela, and even not ruling out boots on the ground, which is a complete contradiction with everything he said about not getting U.S. troops involved in endless wars. But since then, over the weekend, especially through Marco Rubio, who I think is the driver here, the Secretary of State, what you're looking at is regime coercion. And that is, we are going to make this regime, if they want to stay in power, capitulate to our demands. Now, those demands will quite clearly include opening up the oil industry again, not just to Chevron. And of course, Chevron has operated there, the U.S. energy giant. It never has been removed, but to let other American companies back in. It's about opening up the Venezuelan economy, this socialist economy that had begun over Hugo Chavez in the late 90s, much more, quote, free market stuff. In other words, American influence in the economy. And it's about Venezuela limiting or even breaking ties with countries like Cuba, but further afield, Russia, Iran, and China. And people like Rubio and the others are quite happy for Trump to go a little bit crazed now by saying, we'll get you Delcy Rodriguez, because it just keeps that sort of Damocles over her head. While Rubio has been in contact with Rodriguez and laying, I think, some of this out. I mean, this actually does raise the question, and there's been a lot we can go into if you want to, as to whether the regime gave up Maduro. Now, there are stories which are out. They've been out since October in the Miami Herald that Delcy Rodriguez, who was then vice president, was in discussions with the Americans over Maduro stepping down, but that Rodriguez's condition was that Maduro would be allowed to stay in Venezuela and the charges would be dropped against him. And the Trump folks balked at that. It has come out over the weekend that apparently the tipping point, at least for Donald Trump, on top of all this, is no deal with Maduro because he saw him dancing to a soundtrack of his voice saying no crazy wars, right? And I don't rule that out. But I think the thing here is that it raises the question as to whether Rodriguez, but also the Venezuelan military, were quite happy to let Maduro go if it saves them.
Well, if we talk about Rodriguez just quickly, because she's had kind of a remarkable, at least public U-turn in less than 48 hours. On Saturday, she said that what was happening was an atrocity that violates international law and that Maduro was the only president of Venezuela. And now this morning, she's seeking respectful relations with the US and wants to collaborate in the future. I mean, obviously, you've sort of said what you said there. Is this out of a deal with the US, or is this out of fear?
It's dealing with the United States, and in part, yeah, there's concern that they went after Maduro, breaking every international law there is to lift him. Why won't they come after them? Or I think probably the imminent threat would be U.S. airstrikes on military bases, for example. So they want to try to avert that. But the challenge for Rodriguez, and I don't think people are getting into this because a lot of the reporting has covered the U.S. dimension, international dimension, but it's the on-the-ground dimension in Venezuela. Is, look, there's still like a bedrock of supporters for the regime. Most Venezuelans don't support him, but they still have a bedrock of supporters. Now, will that bedrock support for the regime remain if they are effectively saying, yeah, we'll cooperate with the Americans? So there's going to be a balancing act that I think Rodriguez, and again, the military are going to take place. But what concerns me now, beyond the Trump administration's general craziness, and now I'm actually looking at craziness beyond Venezuela, which we can talk about. This is where we get into the Trump aspect. But what concerns me inside Venezuela is, and what's concerning people from Venezuela, according to the reports, is just the uncertainty, right? Because there's the possibility that you could have a military coup. Latin America has military coups quite often, you might remember. And you look at the defense minister, Vladimir Pedrino, who's pretty much very powerful individual. And what if the military says, look, the politicians have completely screwed this up. They screwed up the economy. They brought the American wrath down on us. We're going to come into power here, right? And the U.S., by the way, has been quite happy to support military leaderships rather than democracy through Latin America. But there's also the prospect just simply of insurgency and civil war, that you get factions that are fighting each other. And what was interesting, but almost not noticed, is that the Colombian rebel faction, which of course has been scrapping with the government there for decades, Colombian rebels said they might intervene in this over the weekend. So you can imagine if Colombian rebels cross the border to support their leftist allies in Venezuela, right? There's all that dynamic going on while remembering that the economy is in dire shape and it will not be turned around quickly with Maduro's removal. And this will be the myth that will expose the Trump administration, because you cannot just simply let companies back into the oil industry overnight, and you cannot change the economy overnight. So in Venezuela itself, zone of uncertainty where we're talking about right now, but away from Donald Trump, the administration is going for regime coercion.
And that uncertainty, of course, there's the opposition leader, Maria Mercado. Donald Trump said overnight that elections in the country were not the current priority for the US. I mean, does that completely rule her out forever, or do you see her sort of coming back into the fold?
Marco Rubio, always want to bring it to Rubio rather than, because Rubio actually did the Sunday morning political talk shows yesterday to lay out the lines, and Rubio was asked about the elections. Now remember, this is the same Trump administration that had been all over Vladimir Zelensky for not holding elections while he's facing Russian invasion. And they're saying, Rubio said, well, you have to understand the situation that we're in, great deal of tension and so on, that we've had this complete, for 15 years, this destruction of Venezuela. So it's like, no, don't talk to me about elections at this point. Beyond the fact that elections don't fit the tactic of regime coercion, because the regime's not going to agree to your demands if they're going to get shut down, is Trump doesn't like Machado. It came out from two officials inside the administration who let it be known that Machado was a possibility to be promoted as a leader, and Trump ruled it out because she should have turned down the Nobel Peace Prize. She should have turned it down and said this should be Donald Trump's. And because she didn't do that, Trump vetoed her. Oh, actually, let me add Fergus, because the person to watch, and people are not talking, and again, what are they not talking about, is Eduardo Gonzalez. Now, Eduardo Gonzalez was the man who probably won the 2024 election against Maduro. Venezuelan journalist, I've just listened to a very good one I worked alongside with on a radio broadcast, said 70% of the vote probably went to Gonzalez, former Venezuelan diplomat, but now in exile. If Machado endorsed Gonzalez to come back into country and take over as leader, not a single U.S. official has mentioned the Gonzalez option. So no, we're not talking about elections in the near future.
I want to go back slightly to, you've talked about Rubio and Trump rowing back a little bit on their plans to run Venezuela. I think Rubio used the word leverage, staying away from sort of boots on the ground, which was discussed earlier. I guess there's obviously a material difference, but what is the sort of practical difference between the US running the country and almost running it by proxy, maybe?
Well, it's the difference between what happened in Iraq post 2003 and leaving a regime in place and then trying to bend them to your will.
Can they do that? Yeah, with this regime that they left in place.
Well, yeah. Well, let's talk first about why they went for, again, getting away from Trump's craziness, why they went for regime containment in the end. And it's not just because Trump doesn't like Mariano Machado. Over the weekend, smart people in the administration knew they were in a big spot of bother domestically, right? It's like they've done all this tough guy stuff. They've gotten Maduro. They were playing up the whole boy's own story of what a great operation this was. But the questions were, look, you ran in 24 on a campaign of no foreign interventions, no endless wars. And here you are putting the possibility, because Trump said on Saturday, I don't rule out boots on the ground, right? Boots on the ground is not necessarily a bad thing. And everybody said, well, wait a minute, we voted for you precisely to avoid this situation. So there's that domestic political calculation. Then I think there's the calculation that we've been just discussing about how messy it is to try to simply change a regime and how it can go so badly wrong. And so that, I think, leads to that shift in rhetoric and also that shift in policy, which is made very clear. But now, here's the big question. Will the Venezuelan regime simply accept the American demands? And what happens if they don't? And what I think we're going to get into is we're going to get into a whole mess, which is probably going to last for weeks and maybe months, of the Venezuelan regime trying to do enough just to not completely cut off the Americans, where they have the prospect of another military attack. They want to give themselves enough space to say we're still dealing with the Americans, but they don't want to give way to them too quickly, right? And as I said, the reason why the Venezuelan regime gets a little bit of breathing space is some of these negotiations are really detailed and really, really difficult. The process it took Venezuela almost a decade before it nationalized its oil industry, to the extent that it did. And to, in effect, reverse that nationalization is not an easy process to take place. To change the Venezuelan economy, which for 30 years has been built, almost 30 years, has been built up on the Chavez and then the Maduro approach. Again, with investment, with manufacturing, with agriculture, just the whole question of the way that you run your capital markets, your investment. Now, the Trump folks may be thinking we're going to get an immediate bonanza because all these American consultants are going to go to Venezuela and they're going to do this. And Trump's business buddies will be among them, maybe. But it does mean that I think we're going to get into a very, very messy gray zone here between the Venezuelan regime standing up to the United States and the United States going in to get rid of the regime. It's going to be in between those two poles. And
you think they would, if they don't get what they want in the next weeks and months, then they would do that?
The Americans? Well, that's what Trump's, again, that's what Trump is, Trump is threatening this on the airplane coming back from Air Force One, coming back from Florida last night. Oh yeah, we'll hit them again. We'll hit them again. And Rubio was indicating that as well. So yeah, they're gonna hold that sword of Damocles over their heads, but they're boxed in because if the Trump administration goes in and launches more attacks, you get this mission creep that takes place, right? And the immediate problem they had on Friday was just quite clearly, I use this analogy, I think it's true. It was like a dog chasing a parked car, right? We have 10 warships. We got 15,000 troops. We took your president. And then they get to the parked car and the dog goes, oh, what am I going to do with a parked car? I'm not quite sure what to do now, right? And it was like the Americans were struggling to think about what they were going to do, which is why that press conference on Saturday was so, forgive this expression, you can censor it if you want, crazy. Because we'll dwell on this for a second, because again, what worries me is Trump's craziness beyond this, which we can talk about. But at that press conference on Saturday, they had not thought through what they were going to do. Because Trump gets up there, he lines up Pop Gun Pete Hegseth, Defense Secretary. He's got Rubio behind him. He's got General Dan Kane, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And Trump gets up on stage. And that's when he starts rambling about these guys are going to run Venezuela, right? Like, no, they're not going to. Marco Rubio is not going to run Venezuela. He's got about like 8 different jobs as it is already in the government. Pop Gun Pete, I'm not sure he has the mental capacity to run his own social media accounts, given the experiences of this year, let alone try to run an entire country in Latin America. And you could just look at the body language behind Trump when they're saying this. And so by the end of that press conference, Trump has got them locked in to like this open-ended occupation, which they hadn't agreed to. So they had to come up quickly at that point and think, well, wait a minute, what's our play here? Where are we going to go with this?
Is that causing any sort of disquiet between him and Rubio and Hegseth?
Look, Rubio knows that he is dealing with a president who can go off the rails. And that's why you get a lot of leaks that come, I suspect, out of State Department about how grim this is. Hegseth just wants to play at being the Secretary of War. He don't care. He don't care if Trump drops dead in front of him. He'll still say he's the greatest president ever, right? But it is concerning Rubio. It's concerning the U.S. military, to be honest with you. But they're not going to invoke the 25th Amendment to get rid of Trump. And I guess if you want to, that's what leads me to the worries beyond this, because they might be able to say we'll contain Venezuela with regime containment. But over the past 48 hours, they're walking a tightrope, and who else they threaten?
We're talking about Colombia. He's mentioned Greenland. Mexico. He's mentioned Greenland again, of course. I mean, he's previously mentioned Panama, Mexico, and Canada.
Cuba's next.
Cuba's next. So does the world sort of really start taking these threats seriously now?
I think you have to take them seriously, because there's a strange thing in media where we do this, where we try to like make everything seem logical or rational in terms of how things take place. And you and I think for the first part of this conversation have been trying to make it logical and rational in how they're approaching Venezuela now. And what you realize is, but Trump's not rational. Trump's not logical, and you have to factor that in. So let me just play out the statements as we've got them right now, and then tell you, all right, how do we make sense of where this goes next? All throughout the weekend, he was threatening, he threatened Mexico. So he started on Saturday morning. And then when he came back on the plane from Florida last night, he was still threatening Mexico, right? So, and the thing is that President Sheinbaum, Claudia Sheinbaum, Mexico, she don't take no off Trump, right? And we can go back to the fact where she pushed back his tariff threats. Does he get so ticked off with her that he demands the U.S. military go into Mexico? And certainly, she has said, look, don't do that, So there's all kinds of, and again with Mexico, let's be specific here, that the U.S. excuse of narco terrorism does not work for Maduro in Venezuela. We can discuss that. Mexico is where a lot of the fentanyl is the source of fentanyl for the United States. So there is a cause they could whip up if they wanted to go after Mexico. But then Trump also, at the press conference on Saturday, and he repeated it again on the plane, he talked about Colombia, because Gustavo Petro, who is the left-wing president, he don't take no crap off Trump, and he's been calling him out increasingly. And what Trump said on the plane coming back is that Petro's a drug smuggler, that he smuggles cocaine into the United States, the same pretext they've used with Maduro. Now, there is no evidence that Petro is a drug smuggler, although cocaine is one of the leading sources. Colombia is one of the leading sources of cocaine, right?
Yeah, I think our audience is certainly aware of that fact.
Yeah, exactly. I think they would. But Petro makes the argument, I think with some cause, that he's been trying to limit that or crack down on that. So Colombia then is in the hotspot, but Then Cuba is the one that I think gets really serious, because then you take Trump's craziness and you match it up to the rational of Marco Rubio. Rubio's of Cuban descent. He has, as a senator, all the time he's been in public life, he's had it out for the Cuban regime or government, whatever you want to call it. He would love to see them out of power. Part of the reason why Rubio wanted to go after Venezuela, I think initially for regime change, now for regime containment, is to box in Cuba, to limit Cuba. And when Rubio did the Sunday morning talk shows yesterday, he did not rule out action. In fact, he actually said Cuba needs to watch itself. So he's actually keeping it on the table. Now, what form that action would take is the big question mark. And we might as well add two other countries while we're here, because it goes beyond this Don Roe doctrine, this 21st century doctrine. Greenland, I was playing it down last week. I thought, they're not going to go after Greenland. I mean, it's Denmark. It's a NATO ally. Look, Katie Miller, who is the wife of the evil shadow in the darkness, Stephen Miller, Trump's senior advisor, goes out on social media and slaps an American flag across a map of Greenland, effectively saying, we're taking it. And Trump last night on the plane effectively said, we're going after it.
He said the U.S. needs Greenland, is what he said.
The U.S. needs Greenland. And then lied. Korea said, oh my God, they got all these Chinese and Russian ships that are running around there. Greenland has one of the largest U.S. bases in the world. It's there because it's part of the early warning system against the Russians, formerly the Soviet Union. Yet Trump is somehow saying that Chinese and Russian ships are running around, circling all of that. So, how far will they go with Greenland? Certainly. And the Danish government had to push back this morning. And I will add, because I talked to Canada's CBC over the weekend when we were covering Venezuela, and the host asked me, she said, look, could they do this with Canada? He's called it the 51st state. And I thought she was joking. The idea that special forces would go in and grab Prime Minister Mark Carney, formerly the head of the Bank of England, on some kind of charge that, he was a traitor to the U.S. She wasn't joking. And it's like so it's that mix of a very rational quest for U.S. power with the unpredictability and the chaos of Trump that makes this such a potent and potentially explosive combination.
That quest for power. I'm based in London. I'm calling to you here from London. In the UK, I mean, it's to be expected, I guess, with the special relationship between the US and the UK. Our politicians have been very sort of straight down the line, non-committal, say, we need to get all the facts first before we form an opinion. Everything we've just spoken about there, is there a red line for US allies?
I don't know. When you get Keir Starmer's head out of the sand, maybe you can ask him that. You can tell I'm not happy with that statement, right? Oh, we've got to gather more information. We've got to look at more. What more information do you need to have? Did you not see them kidnap the head of a sovereign state? No matter how repulsive, how repressive and evil that man is.
Well, I think, is this where some of the issues lie? With Maduro, obviously, he was very unpopular, with a lot of European states. If they move to perhaps Colombia or Greenland, surely that's a different kettle of fish.
Yeah, okay, I know. But look, the problem, I'm just adding a thing. Look, the problem you have made here, and you have made a fundamental mistake, and it's not just Starmer. The French also have been like, we don't like Maduro either. Kaja Kallas, the EO foreign policy, said everyone's being careful. And there's a practical reason here. A very good practical reason they're being careful is they need Trump's support to keep backing Ukraine against the Russian invasion. And we're at a very crucial time of all those negotiations. So I kind of understand what they do it. But the problem with the Starmer statement is he never made a reference to international law, never made a reference to it. And it's also the problem with some of the other European statements, because what the Americans have done here is they've set the precedent that you can just trash international law. And it is an absolutely valid comparison to say, look, the Chinese could sweep into Taiwan, seize the president of Taiwan and say, you violated our law about one China. We're going to put you on trial. Vladimir Putin, who's been trying to assassinate Volodymyr Zelensky all along, if he ever succeeds in it, can say this is a perfectly justified assassination because Zelensky was violating Russian law, right? That's what they've opened up the door to. And they've opened it up with these other countries as well, right? Now, I'll talk to you about practical red lines, but in terms of the legal red line, what is to stop the United States from going in and kidnapping Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, and claiming that he's a cocaine smuggler? Wash. And if you don't raise international law and they need to defend it, you have given up that position. What is to prevent the Americans from bombing Cuba with the idea that the Cubans have committed all kinds of crimes under the Castro regime going back to 1959? Practically, do I think they will do it? I don't, because I think right now they're going to have their hands full with Venezuela. And I think they've got, I don't think they're going to have an easy win with Venezuela. And so you can't pick up another conflict as well. I also think something that we haven't paid enough attention to is that Latin America is split over this. Trump has some allies that are backing him, like the chainsaw guy down in Argentina, Javier Milei, Ecuador, the incoming president of Chile. But the current president of Chile, the Brazilians, the Colombians, Panama, Mexico, backed by Spain, have come out strongly against this. So I think that's a practical limit on how far they go. But here's my problem. I'm being rational again. And if Trump takes the hump over something to such an extent that he wants to have a pop at someone, could he be held back? Would he be held back? And it's not just Trump. Yeah, the people who hold him back right now is like Rubio will say, as we've seen with Venezuela, let's keep the focus here. Probably the U.S. military will try to hold him back in terms of what our capabilities are, what we can do, et cetera. His business buddies might hold him back because it doesn't make for good business to go in and tear up too many countries at the same time, no matter what you think the long-term opportunities are. NATO allies quietly will try to hold them back by talking to American officials. It'll come from multiple levels. But what worries me here is not just the irrational of Trump. It's a different type of craziness, albeit a much more rational craziness. He's got certain advisors like Stephen Miller and in particular J.D. Vance. And I'm not sure if those guys have limits on them. And I'm really worried about Vance, by the way, because Vance is going to make his run for 28 on being the toughest of the tough guys. And there's also the wild card, and I'll just throw this into the mix. When you got people like Donald Trump Jr. running around and going, remember he was up in Greenland, make Greenland great again, yada, 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 wearing the caps. He popped up in a couple of other places talking about where American investments can be made recently. It's, I think the fundamental, Fergus, because I'm running around here, is there are no more rules of the game. However much we try to make this rational and so on, there are no more rules of the game. There are no more alliances for the Trump folks. There are no more regional organizations that are the lines here. There is only what Donald Trump thinks is good for Donald Trump and what his advisors think is good for American power. And that's the new world that we have to try to deal with, starting with Venezuela, but going across the globe beyond Latin America to Europe and elsewhere.
Just finally, you mentioned across the globe there. We've covered so much. This has kind of far-reaching consequences. I just want to ask quickly about China, because they've spoken out this morning asking for Maduro to be released. And I don't think that's going to happen. But before this current crisis, oil-rich Venezuela exported 921,000 barrels per day. That's according to Reuters. And China took about 80% of those. Now, China said this morning it expects that arrangement to continue. If that were not to happen, that would be a significant escalation.
It'd be an escalation, but it wouldn't hurt the Chinese primarily, because the Chinese will grab oil from elsewhere. Because where could the Chinese get oil if they don't get it from Venezuela? Oh, maybe Russia, where the U.S. has been trying to prevent the Chinese from taking Russian oil with the sanctions on Russia's leading oil companies. So China could perhaps do it there. China could try to talk to the Gulf states about taking more oil coming out of the Gulf states, or China could talk to Iran, where the United States had been trying to put pressure on a regime which is in trouble in Iran. So China's got options here. Look, I think the biggest question here is if Venezuela's supplies start to be severely limited, what happens to the global oil market? Which right now, the oil prices dropped this morning. They actually think that we're going to come out of this with Venezuela production being ramped up because that's the projection now, that you get this cooperative relationship between Venezuela and the Trump folks, and the industry starts to increase output. We'll see. You start disrupting oil production, and remember, the Trump administration's reiterated it's going to seize Venezuelan tankers. That threat has not been lifted, and we'll see what happens. I'll make a broader point here, Fergus. Perhaps maybe we could follow it up in a later podcast. I think a lot of people are trying to talk about the motives of why the Trump folks did this is they're trying to limit Chinese influence in the Western Hemisphere. I think that's way overblown. And I just am going to lay it out there for others to come in there. China certainly has economic links with Venezuela, as we've just mentioned. China is trying to expand its economic footprint in Latin America as part of its alternative economy. You could talk about, for example, the Chinese companies that operate along the Panama Canal, right? But the idea that China was running the Venezuela government, or that this was to be the base of the Chinese military presence in Latin America, no. And to be honest with you, part of the reason why I say that is I used to hear those types of stories as rationales all during the Cold War, whenever the United States overthrew a government, right?
Yes. So would you say it's purely domestic U.S. interests?
I'd say, if you want me to summarize, I'd say it's ego, because you got certain people that want to look like tough guys, beginning with Donald Trump, who never served in the U.S. military because of those mysterious bone spurs in his feet, and Pete Hegseth, who did serve in the military, but just as head of a National Guard unit. It then continues with oil, which is a practical consideration, but also an obsession with Trump. It then goes into the idea of having a compliant regime in Venezuela to do what we want to do. But I think the big thing, Fergus, here is go back to another thing that Trump said on Saturday, where he goes, it's the Don Roe Doctrine. You idiot. 1823 Monroe Doctrine was initially designed to tell the Europeans, you back off, this is our hemisphere. But the Monroe Doctrine became, especially in the 20th century, a doctrine used by America against the countries of Latin America. You do what we want you to do. Cuba, after the Spanish were defeated at the turn of the 20th century, Nicaragua in the 1930s, Guatemala, 1950s, Chile, 1970s, Allende, Brazil, 1960s coup, Ecuador, 1960s coup, Panama, 1989, removal of Noriega. What you've got is, beyond Trump's renaming of the Don Roe Doctrine, is you've got a 21st century version of 19th century US colonialism, but it's on steroids now. And that is, well, let's just quote the national security strategy. The Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, as they framed it, is that we control the Western Hemisphere economically, politically, militarily. That's the wider play that is here, but it's controlling it not just against the Chinese or against the Russians or whatever. It's controlling it against the countries in Latin America. They are there to serve U.S. interest, which is why the one country I'm going to watch is the biggest country in South America over the next couple of days, which is Brazil, to see which way they break on whether or not they'll accept this.
Scott, it's been an incredibly busy start to 2026 here on the Trump Report. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today. I'm sure it won't be the last time we speak over the next few weeks.
Stay safe, stay sane.